welcome back to It Takes a Village, where we are diving into deep questions about how to build community, how to get to know each other on a deeper level, and how to curate the kind of relationships that really foster human growth. So thank you for being here, Sarah. What an exciting time.
Yes, thank you. This feels like a especially deep dive today with some intense topics. So just take care of yourselves, everybody, as you're watching and listening. And we're working through these chapters together.
I know there's a lot here. It felt like sort of rereading this time. We're diving into 3 chapters. It's from David Brooks' How to Know a Person, The Epidemic of Blindness, Hard Conversations, and How Do You Serve a Friend in Despair. And I felt like each one of these chapters we could have spent a whole episode on, right? The epidemic of blindness starts with these really difficult statistics about naming where we are in society, and mostly it's not a good outlook. It looks like nothing that we really want to read and then reflect on our own lives. You know, people are really isolated. People are really hurting. And he calls it this epidemic because clearly this has been for at least the last decade, you know, with statistics. But he talks about how many, over the last 20 years, we're recording spending time with friends, you know, like however many hours a week, and it has just decimated. I mean, people spend a couple of hours maybe with friends a week, and people are finding themselves more and more isolated. I think of, you know, social media. I think of so many things that brought us to this point. But David Brooks shares some startling statistics. I think that just remind us why it's so important to be part of community. And faith community here at Countryside is one of those ways that we can stay connected and then support each other in times where isolation turns to, for some, you know, bitterness, fear, resentment, and then unfortunately even violence. It's just, it's a difficult time right now, but we are thankful that we have these great resources and that we have each other to do this work together.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, and some of these statistics are staggering, right? You pulled out 36% of Americans say they feel lonely most or all of the time. And in 2021, 44% of teens reported persistent feelings of sadness or hopelessness. That's just as a mom of teens, right? That's really hard to hear and makes me wonder, you know, what my kids would say about themselves and their friends if they're picking up on that within their high schools and middle schools.
I know, and, you know, just last week, my son who's 11, you know, Sage, he, at bedtime, it's always at bedtime, it's like, here's the day, and then we're gonna, and these things come up, but he was like, you know, I've just had lots of bad news today. And I was expecting it to be, you know, you don't get to go outside for your second recess or something. But he shared about one student who, you know, has been hurting themselves, you know, like I think he cutting on his arms and things. And that, you know, it's obviously a traumatizing thing for that child. And then for the students to wonder, he's like, is that okay? It's like, no, you know, he must, you know, so be a friend to him and a listener to him. And then another even more, you know, kind of devastating thing about harm. I think, you know, 11 in elementary school, if you have these kinds of conversations and these kinds of experiences at that age, clearly we need to lean in deeper to find ways of resourcing even our students and our children who are hearing these from peers. You know, of course he was like, well, the counselor, you know, she knows and she's being helpful. But yeah, it's just so much trauma for children and teenagers who've lived, you know, through the pandemic with isolation, you know, tenfold, and are now kind of, you know, trying to find their way and some footing and some support. But yeah, I mean, I don't know that there's anything that really speaks to this population and how we fix any of these things. In fact, right, there's no fixing. It's this whole work of abiding and listening. He does talk about trauma in this chapter, and it, you know, sprinkles that throughout the book. But that book that we were talking about, The Body Keeps the Score, where he said something about that was pretty intense. I'm trying to remember the quote.
Yeah, I can share it if you want.
Yeah.
Knowing that we are seen and heard by the important people in our lives can make us feel calm and safe. Being ignored or dismissed can precipitate rage or mental collapse. And so I think about, you know, like what Sage was sharing with you and being able to feel calm and safe, I imagine. Right. And the way that helps to mitigate the kind of secondary trauma that he's picking up from hearing about his peer or knowing his friend who's doing that. You know, I think that I can't help but think about the way that our schools here in Omaha have been affected by gun violence recently. And just knowing that our kids are at school potentially like in fight or flight all the time, worrying about, the school being placed on a hold or on lockdown, and just what that does to their bodies and their nervous systems. And it does feel so systemic that it can lead to this sense of hopelessness and helplessness. But I have to believe that at least if we can help respond to them in ways like what Basil van der Kolk is saying, that we can just help them to know that they have people that are safe to process it with, even though it doesn't actually necessarily fix what's going on.
I know. I mean, that quote really struck me because of the, important people in our lives. If we are seen by the important people in our lives, for some kids, that's maybe not a parent. They may not even have two parents or one parent in a home. It might be their grandmother. It might be the school counselor. It might be their best friend. I know that Quinn, my daughter, is 9, and last year, her best friend from school, we moved here half the year in November.
Right.
And her best friend from school, such a sweet girl, she shared that her mother was in prison and that she could never do play dates because she would need to go home and make dinner for her little brothers. And it was one of those, red flags for me as a parent in reaching out to the counselor. And she did have some other family support in her home. But the kinds of experiences that children go through that we don't even know, right? So it's so important. And there are other statistics, right, on children need 7 healthy adults in their lives who see them and know them for a healthy, differentiated relationship building. So that important person could be you, right? It could be any of us.
Right.
If they have one important person who sees them, right, that they have much more chance to be safe and calm and to develop healthy lives. One quote that he shared that I think is sort of the opposite of that, right, is that when you don't have that and there's rage, right, potential because you have harm, hurt, dismissal, you've been avoided, you don't have care, and that isolation and grief and fear can potentially turn to an outlet of rage. It says any pain that's not transformed gets transmitted. And like you were talking about the school shootings, I could not help but think about that particular quote, right? And sort of, the perpetrators are also so often such victims themselves to this kind of lack of support at an early age and throughout their lives. He shares that really sad story about the guy that they nicknamed Trunk because he was going on his way, to inflict harm. And he had an arsenal, right, of weaponry in his trunk. And he said if only, someone had seen him and asked him and said, hey, it's okay. How can I support you or be here for you? Like a friendly, just, I see you. He would have just stopped and said, okay, and let go, right? He needed to be seen. And then the lack of that kind of care and connection drove him to anger out of his isolation, right? Even that isolated act, perpetuates violence, but it carves a deeper hole, right? That was just devastating.
Yeah, it's so difficult to know that people feel this way, and the idea that we can just help connect. It sounds like it's not enough, but it's something, and I think that we can. That seems to be a consistent theme in what we're learning in this book, and just the conversations we've been having. That we have to do something. Something is better than nothing. And to do what we can, not what we can't, and at least start there, right? Not just to wring our hands and pull the covers over our head because we're not sure if it's enough.
That's right. Yeah, I mean, it makes me, think of so much of the life and work of Jesus, right? Right throughout the Gospels, it's one child, right, who he's going to hold, one woman on the margins that he's going to reach out to heal, one man, who is blind and he's going to go out of his way. It's these small acts, but it's these intentional small acts that Jesus calls us to that changes everything.
Yeah.
So not only does it change maybe someone's ability to thrive, right, when we see them, but it's transformative, right? To be someone who might be afraid of reaching out, right? You might know, like, gosh, this person seems, sad or unwell, or they're new and, I should probably say hello. I mean, to get over that first little trepidation of putting yourself out there, it can mean the world to that person who we have no idea what really is going on within them. But to see that smile and to just say, hi, how are you? Or whatever it is, it can change everything.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it's worth the risk, right? It's sort of like we talked about in the very first time we sat down to talk about this book, that it's risky to put yourself out there and to ask questions and try to engage people, because they may reject your engagement, but it's worth it to try, and better to kind of try and know that we have this community to kind of fall back on and comfort us if we do get rejected, but that the impact we could make from making that effort could just really be indescribable.
I know, it's so powerful. Yeah, but you know what is so unfortunate? I feel like we know these things, right? And reaching out, we know that one small act can be transformative, right, for someone else's life and our own. But we often just default, right, to finding our own place of isolation, right? That's scary, or I have too much to do, or whatever it is. And so instead of, doing those small acts that can be amazing, right, for others, we just kind of stay in our isolated places of protection, right? We fail to reach out, which I think leads us to our next chapter, hard conversations. I mean, who's excited about this this conversation? Hard conversations. Brooks talks about how we tend to avoid things that are uncomfortable. And I think we don't have to read a book to know that we do that, right? But the more and more we avoid hard conversations, it just deepens the isolation between us, right? If we're already struggling on a lifeline out here, having those hard conversations moves us closer, right? At least to trust, respect, dignity, right? Respecting that you'll hear me when I do. Yeah, but we avoid those.
Yeah. I mean, exactly. He starts this chapter by sharing some of his experiences where people confronted him with their anger. And then the quote that he shares says, "You can't get to know another person while pretending not to see ideology, class, faith, race identity, or any of the other fraught social categories. Our encounters are shaped by our historical inheritances, the legacies of slavery, elitism, sexism, prejudice, bigotry, and economic and social domination."
I know. I mean, that's a mouthful. To see someone, to know someone, you have to see the full person, the whole person, the context, who they are right now, but who they are because of their lived and shaped history, their inherited history. And I love how he says this, because it reminds us of our own social locations, right? That's something that we can't ignore. This hit home for me. I was reading about this experience he shared about being on the panel with this intellectual African-American woman who is talking about like the culture war, right? And she basically bases that on, earliest systemic racism that has been a part of this country and a part of our founding, throughout, right? And so she's talking with that as a grounding context. And then he starts talking about at a higher level, right? I think this understanding that he could, or anyone could, differentiate that social location, right, from the lens not only that they are seeing and analyzing this culture war, but their own personhood as a part of that. And so for her, you can't extricate someone, right, who's a part of this lived and shaped history. And so when she says, no, this is what it is, I think he corrects himself later, talking about how, probably I could have done this or that. One thing he does say is something about, I wish, I had gone back and done it this way, and I wish I had explained further my point of view. And this was one of those moments of cringing, because I think we've also all done that, especially us. I'm a white woman of privilege, right? Oh, wait, I didn't say the right thing. Let me say again my perspective one more time, which for me felt like, whoa, an autocorrect in general. That's exactly the opposite of what he should have done or we should have done, right? It's see her, listen to her, and understand that this is a deep, truth that she will never be altering, right, this perspective. And all we can do is turn our heads, right, because we're not getting that. Right. I mean, systemic racism persists in every corner of America, right? So that was one of those haunting moments of, he's wonderful and great in bringing this to our attention and was able to say, wait, whoa, I should have done this. And then he has this great way of talking about framing. I would love to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, he says this line about, in whose frame are we speaking? Are we trying to push the conversation into our frame, or are we willing to meet someone where they are And I think about the idea that when we ask people to share their experience, that, you know, when you ask someone, what was that like for you? Or what is this like for you? And if they are willing to share, you cannot argue with that, right? Like, you might disagree, or you might say, like, oh, if I were you, I wouldn't have seen it that way. But when you're asking someone to describe an experience, especially if you know that they are coming from a different sort of social perspective, you can't tell them they're wrong, you know. And even if you have a different experience, that's part of what systemic racism tells us, is that I might go somewhere as a white woman, and because of all of these systems that are in place in our country, I will be received a certain way. And a friend who is a black man might go and be received in a completely different way. And I can't say, well, what did that happen to you? You know, I went to that same store and they were great to me.
Right.
You know, like, you have to understand that is the each person's telling is accurate for them. But just because I didn't have a negative experience, it doesn't mean that someone else didn't.
No, I think that's so powerful listening to you talk about that. It's like what we do when someone else has been dehumanized in some way. There's really nothing that our perspective, right, can share to rehumanize, which means like taking away that experience. All you can do is bear witness, right? The bearing witness is the rehumanization, because this person, right, in their own isolation or prejudice or in judgment against them, what they're really needing is to be seen, right? Picking up the pieces of it reminds me of one of my best friends who came out to her parents as a lesbian, and her father said, you know, well, we're just going to agree to disagree on this. And I thought, how much more painful a response from your parent. You can't agree to disagree on someone's personhood and on the integrity and the dignity of that person, right? And so, like, you can't disagree with someone's experience. You can't disagree with someone's personhood, right? Which, if you think about trauma or in the systemic racism, right, and injustice, it's not only the trauma that modern day community is living, right, in that oppression or judgment. It's the inherited legacies of slavery impacting these people over and over and over again. So whether it's race or faith, religious trauma is a major thing, right? Rehumanizing is really about bearing witness to your pain by listening and being present and holding space for. And that, you know, that's hard. And there are hard conversations that we need to know when to speak, when to listen, right? Part of that is knowing. And I think Brooks gives some pretty good practical advice there.
Yeah, he talks about the importance of listening, really listening, without immediately trying to defend your point of view. And he emphasizes curiosity, being open to the idea that you might learn something that changes your perspective. And certainly in engagements like this, like in conversations where you want to hear someone else's experience, it's definitely not winning an argument, right? It's not an argument. And, you know, I think that that's where real dialogue comes in. We may not want to believe that the world is the way that it is. Right. And there's ways in which in our privileged experience, we haven't had to encounter all of the different ways that systemic racism or prejudice or classism, all these things show up. But when we hear from folks who have experienced them, we have to appreciate that that is real. And it shows us facets of our world that we might not want to see, but that we do need to grapple with to see the whole picture.
Yeah, I mean, that's such a crucial point, because it's one thing to hear something that kind of makes you want to run and hide and avoid, because humans want to avoid challenging or difficult conversations. It's one of those, like, put your head in the sand, I want this to go away. But not only does that further say your pain is your pain, and it doesn't matter to me, it's not affecting me, it also tells you that you can't move past your fear to engage, right? Because there's something in us that says, I don't have the capacity for, right? But we do have the capacity. We have the empathy, the compassion, we have the capacity, but it takes a commitment. It takes being there for the discomfort in that moment of, oh, this is really hard. But I think the great reward is after you commit to that and hold space and listen, you're transformed. That empathy only grows. And there's this great capacity that you didn't realize that you had. And that's kind of, I think, what is available to us when our friends face real deep despair. And in this next chapter, Brooks really deals with this and names losing a friend, right? In a way that he never expected to,
Yeah.
right? Someone whose pain and grief was so big, but not visible to the world around him, right? And so it leads us to kind of ask these questions about what is it that moves us to see and acknowledge and then act on, right? Viewing into someone else's life that they are struggling, and what keeps us from seeing that, right? And I don't know if there's any real solution there, but is there anything we can do? What can we do when we feel that a friend has some kind of deep despair? Is there a role for us to play?
Yeah, I mean, I think his case kind of is that there is a role for us to play, right? That being with friends in a time like this, even when we can't fix it, because we can't, and trying to fix it can often make it worse, offering solutions, trying to make a lot of suggestions. It's not necessarily going to land with that person, and it can alienate us from them. But he says even worse is doing nothing, to avoid it because we feel like we're inadequate, or we might say the wrong thing. That's just not the answer. And it is really hard. It's hard to know how to be with people in these situations, to be with people who just really seem to have an unfixable problem in their lives, whether it's, in this case, talking about depression and kind of mental health concerns, or, I think we talk sometimes and have on our prayer lists and things, folks who have chronic pain, or who have just sort of intractable illnesses. And we don't know what to do, but we have to keep accompanying them and showing up.
That's right. He writes that sometimes the greatest act of friendship is simply to sit in silence with them, to be a witness to their pain without trying to alter it. That's such a beautiful idea, and it kind of reflects back on this book, Kolk's book, The Body Keeps the Score, about how trauma lives in the body. Healing doesn't happen by forcing the process or avoiding the pain. It happens when we feel safe enough to experience those emotions fully. And that requires like a steady presence of someone who's willing to sit and abide and be there for the days when someone might open their eyes, or the days when someone is not present at all. I mean, I know that we both have stories of visiting people who have severe pain, severe trauma, severe illness and ailments, whether it's cancer diagnoses or other things. And this, one of the saddest things in the world, right, is to know that when you go visit them, it might be the only visit that month that they have, right? That there's someone not sitting, and someone not being present, and someone not abiding, right, and holding the space. And that might be any of us, right? You might be the only friend that, you think you're not very special to them, but you may be the only person who says, you know what, I'm going to knock on their door because I haven't seen them come out in 5 or 6 days. I'm going to make that phone call because, I've been thinking about them. But we might be the only person who makes that step forward. And again, like, it changes, how healing is possible. And healing may not be physical. It may just be this, someone sees me and I can hear someone. I may not be able to be present, but my spirit and my body knows that you're here. It's that deep abiding presence that is transformative.
It really is. And I love that we're reading this book together as a community, because it is giving us tools and helping us to learn that we can develop this skill, even when we don't get the results that we hope for. Like in this chapter, it was, I don't know about you, but as I was reading it, I did not know that it would end the way it would end. I had hoped that David Brooks's friend Pete would recover from his depression. And so it's hard to know that he didn't, and there may not have been anything that would have changed that, but the fact that we can learn to show up and be with each other and bear witness and take care of each other. And I mean, honestly, I just tell people sometimes, and I do myself, like, put reminders in your phone if you want to check on people, right? It doesn't mean that when you actually take the step of reaching out that it is diminished in any way because you were reminded to do it. It's sort of like reminding yourself to sign papers for your kid at school. I mean, it doesn't mean that you don't care because you might forget to do that, but just being cognizant of each other and finding a way to incorporate that in and not lose track of each other, I think is so important. And that's something we can really practice working on in our church setting and in community with each other.
Yeah, I think that, so much of David Brooks' approach to this work of deeply seeing each other and letting ourselves be deeply known is all about skills building, right? He approaches this as deeply empathetic and compassionate kind of work, but his approach is this should be something, a first grader could do. Right? And so it's so accessible. He's inviting all of us to look at the barriers that might be there, that the reasons that maybe we're afraid, or if we have some deep anger or trauma, that would hold us back, right? There's a lot here. And if we just sort of start to understand that all we have to do is like one thing at a time. See the person who is in the car with you. See the person who is in the bed beside you. See the person you're walking into church with, or maybe you're sitting on the pew with. So seeing is the first step. It acknowledges that the human in me sees the human in you, and the spirit within both of us can alter the course. And I think that's really deeply powerful. I know that, with trauma and grief, depression and loss, loss is such a pervasive experience, right, for each one of us, because whether it's losing, to death someone that we love, or losing kind of a part of us based on a traumatic experience or a diagnosis. If loss is such a deep part, we have to really learn how to also allow growth and healing to be equally as a part. Because we are fragmented humans and frail, but we also have the power to change how we experience this world.
Yeah, we do. And we can learn it. We can learn it together. We can continue to stretch and grow our capacity and develop these skills. And, none of us can just throw up our hands and say, well, I'm just not like that. Or I just don't have the ability to do that. We can learn. And, I love our theme of it takes a village. We're here at the village at Countryside, being able to learn and practice together.
Yeah, and that's what David Brooks is inviting us to do. I know that you are doing this, some of you in your small groups. So thank you for joining us for It Takes a Village. Know that if you have questions or you need to reach out to anyone, you can always reach out to us, and you can find the work of God's healing presence here in this community. We'll see you next time.